So for this afternoon session, we are going to have two presentations kind of jointly given by two of the leading tech organizations in this battle against IUU phishing. Firstly, we have Charlie Gilmore, who is from Global Phishing Watch. Global Phishing Watch is probably many of you know its website and have had maybe had a chance to look at what data services it offers. And I'll leave Charlie to explain more about it. He's obviously the expert. Charlie is the Director of Analysis and Capacity Building at the organization. And together he'll be presenting with Duncan Copeland. Duncan is from an organization called Transshipment Tracking, or TMT. That's based in Norway, is that correct? Yeah. And Duncan is the executive director there. Transshipment Tracking is much more of a, rather than so much a spatial analysis tool, much more an investigative tool in terms of aspects such as we've been talking about beneficial ownerships and the business structure that underlies some of these phishing operations. So without further ado, I will pass across. I think we're going to have a very interesting and interactive session where they'll be able to highlight particular case studies and examples from around the world as to how to use these tools, and with the hope that you can actually become experts in using these tools in your own countries and use them to help solve the problems that you're dealing with. So please, Duncan and Charlie.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. It's excellent to be here. And I think the comment was made yesterday, it's very hard to come after lunch, so we will do our best to entertain you. So yes, I'm Duncan Copeland. I'm the Executive Director of TMT. I'm here with Charles Kilgour. We are representing our organizations, but we're also representing a relatively new cooperation framework between a number of different non-state actors that are working in the IUU phishing space. And we have different structures, but we all have a common objective, and that is to work with partner countries, particularly developing states, on the provision of tools, systems, data, and capacity to target IUU phishing and broader fisheries governance issues. So today we're going to be covering an introduction to this cooperation, which is called the Joint Analytical Cell, or JAC for short, and a look at the partner organizations beyond just TMT and Global Phishing Watch. We've been asked to specifically look at the vessel tracking element of our work. So we'll be presenting a general overview of vessel tracking, but also looking specifically at some of the tools that the JAC utilizes, but are also made available to the countries that we work with. And I should really highlight that this is a global initiative, and we'll really look at what that means for different regions and countries around the world. We'll look at transshipment as well, something else we've been asked to look at, and a particular tool that Global Phishing Watch has developed there around that, called the Carrier Portal. We will stop here and there for specific areas of Q&A. However, I really encourage, if anybody does have a particular question or clarification they'd like, please raise your hand, and we'll try and accommodate those and make this as interaction session as possible, particularly when we get to the tool demonstration. I'm very happy to accommodate those. So I'll start with the Joint Analytical Cell. As I say, this is a very new initiative. We formally established this in January 2022, and it was publicly announced at the UN Oceans Conference in Lisbon in June. It's new in its formation, but it's not new in the sense that the founding organizations, TMT, Global Phishing Watch, and the International Monitoring, Control, and Surveillance Network, we've all been working with each other for some years on a project basis, on a particular country or regional basis, and so on. It made sense, though, to more formalize that cooperation for a number of reasons. We're trying to harness the innovative technology that the different organizations are developing the complementary expertise and resources, and also particularly the international collaborations. The founding organizations have different geographical priorities and focuses. IMCS network is global, but with a particular focus in the Pacific. Global Fishing Watch, again global, but a large program in Latin America. TMT in West, Eastern, and Southern Africa. So it allows us as organizations not to sort of try and muddle the waters of who's working where, but to leverage our capabilities beyond the regions that we are specifically working in. The JAC recognizes that these collaborations were happening between ourselves, but also with various partners, but more and more in isolation of each other. And this was creating confusions and this creating blockages. And to be honest, it was also creating some challenges around funding processes and so on. So we seek to overcome that. And we also want to use the available data and tools and technologies more effectively to provide higher quality and more powerful analysis, and particularly tailoring those to the needs to individual countries, regions, even at the fisheries level. And this, of course, in turn, makes sure that things are more cost-effective as well. Cost-effective to the organizations, but most importantly to our partner countries. We have shared goals, targeting IUU fishing right at the top of those, but also very complementary aspects in terms of increasing overall transparency of fishing activity at sea, building the MCS capacity of our partner countries, this leveraging of data and technology to inform and support global fisheries policy processes. A big focus is the evidence basing of why those changes are needed. Very often it's very easy to say, we've got this problem, but you really need to evidence base those to develop the tailored solutions that we were discussing this morning for particular fisheries or regions or issues. We also have a shared goal, and this again goes to something that was discussed this morning, which is the provision of long-term technical assistance to developing states free of charge. This is a really important core component of what we're trying to achieve. We are not private businesses. All of us are not-for-profit organizations. And so we seek funding from a number of different sources in order to be able to pass on tools, technologies, and the technical assistance to developing states with no cost to them in terms of that side. Of course, there is a commitment in terms of personnel and so on at home, but not for our services and our tools. We are focusing on a few key areas when we're talking about the IUU issue. First one is around intelligence-led port controls. This is particularly focused around that advanced request for entry to port. This is where you need to make the decision. Do I want this vessel in my port? Yes or no? Am I going to assign my limited inspection resources to this vessel? Yes or no? If I am going to inspect it, where's the risk? What do I want to target in that inspection? It's where the intelligence and the risk assessment is so key. Fisheries planning and patrol planning and support, transshipment monitoring programs, what we call action-centric MCS capacity building. So this is really building capacity for personnel and countries to use tools, to be good analysts themselves, and to be able to use that information to plan their operations and inform their decisions. And then we have a sort of catch-all focus, which is called global issues of interest. And again, this feeds into what I was saying earlier about how can we evidence-base, how we can feed the information that we see on the ground into those global dialogues. And a particular focus right now is the global squid fleet, which I'm sure all of you have seen, very high profile in media and news and so on. So who are the partners? I'll start with TMT. So we are based in Norway. We're a small organization. We've been in place since 2014. I'm one of the co-founders. As an organization, we essentially have an inside-out approach. By that I mean we are not a campaigning or advocacy organization. We are there to work in technical assistance to the countries we work with, providing intelligence and analysis to assist enforcement actions and broader improvements in fisheries governance. We provide cutting-edge fisheries intelligence, close cooperation, capacity building, and facilitative information sharing between governments, international government, IGOs, and NGOs. We have a strong focus on working with interagency cooperation within the countries that we work in, and the development of tools to assist in the capture and analysis of information. We primarily work in the industrial fishery space. It's important to highlight. And we have staff in various regions: Norway, UK, Ghana, Botswana, Belgium, Taiwan. So we're very dispersed in terms of focus. And this is how we work. So the intelligence-led MCS, analytical and operational assistance. We work with countries both bilaterally, as in one-on-one, but as much as possible also through regional country partnerships. That we work on something called the task force model. So there's two primary task forces we work with. One in the West Africa region, which is called the West Africa Task Force, and is essentially the MCS working group of the FCWC, and then again in East Africa with the SADC groups. And within that, there are strong information sharing and best practice elements. Targeted capacity building. We are very focused on the pointy end of this issue. The capacity building and the support that we provide is very much hands-on, on-the-job type of training. Learning by doing. Within the JAC, we're the analytical lead. TMT Senior Analyst is the analytical coordinator for the whole JAC partnership. And we particularly lead also on the port and patrol support access. And we have roles in the broader capacity building and so on. We are integrating the JAC into our existing partnerships. This is a key part of the JAC. So where TMT has been leading initiatives in East and West Africa and other regions, TMT is still the lead in those regions, but we are integrating the JAC partnership and the tools and expertise that come within the partnership into those. And then we are contributing to some of the tool development, some of which we're going to be presenting to you today. At this point, I'm going to hand over to Charlie to introduce Global Fishing Watch and talk a little bit about their role within the JAC. And then we'll talk about a few of the other partners very quickly as well.
Thanks, Duncan. Right, so this, you may not be familiar with Global Fishing Watch in terms of its platform and website, but I can go a little bit more about the organization, because we have essentially a sort of a product team that does develop, with an engineering team that does develop the map that we have that's freely available on the internet. But we also have the sort of program delivery side, so where we're working and partnering with governments, and that's very much around increasing sort of what the transparency of the human activity at sea. So that we make a public map to have access to, for people to see on there what vessels are doing and what activity they can see in fisheries on the water. That's freely available. And we also work with governments where they just help facilitate and work with, so we provide technical support, but also facilitate and help them to share data and increase the sort of transparency of their fisheries data as well. And our sort of like long-term goal is sort of trying to help monitor and visualize as much of the impact on the ocean from human activity as possible. And that's really focusing sort of on the industrial scale, but working more and more with small scale and thinking about how we can support that sector as well with providing sort of tools and data. This is a picture. We'll go into it in more detail, so I won't get too locked into this. But this is a picture just like of the map. There's sort of lots of different layers turned on. You can see kind of like a heat map, essentially a fishing activity, both from two different data sources, AIS and VMS here. So the regions we're working in, we've got a program in Latin America. We're working with a number of countries there. And we also have a program in Africa, very much connected in with TM tracking. We work in Asia and also a team in Pacific. And finally, we're also working with a team in Europe, but that's mostly focused at the Mediterranean at the moment. So we have a regional sort of implementation structure. Do you want to do IMSS network?
Yep.
Yeah.
So the other founding partner is something called the International MCS Network. Many of the countries represented here today are members of the International MCS Network. Its mission is to promote and facilitate cooperation and coordination amongst its members through information exchange, capacity development, and joint work. It's an informal and voluntary organization. So it's mostly countries, but it also includes some of the RFMOs and a number of organizations like ourselves who are there as official observers. It was formed in 2001, so it's been going for over 20 years now. And as I say, it's an affiliation of various countries and different organizations now. It has a number of roles, particularly around the strengthening of MCS capacity building, trainings, equipment. It also has a register of vetted MCS experts that can be called upon by countries or by projects and so on. It plays a very strong role, particularly in the Pacific, around the Tuna Compliance Network and the Pan-Pacific Fisheries Compliance Network. And within the JAC, it's taking a leading role in terms of the planning and the execution of MCS capacity building, particularly through this collaborative needs assessment process that has been developed. Another partner who has just recently joined is an organization called Skylight, which is also a platform called Skylight. Some of you might have come across this. And you're starting to see a common theme. Different partners coming into this have platforms and skills and expertise. Part of the reason that we formed the JAC was that we were becoming more and more aware that there was growing confusion by many stakeholders, particularly countries, about what is the difference between Skylight and Global Fishing Watch. How can I best use these for my needs within the fishery, my fisheries enforcement picture? How do these integrate with what I've got already, national systems and so on? So Skylight, this was launched by the late Paul Allen, who you may remember as one of the co-founders with Bill Gates of Microsoft. And it's now part of what's called the Allen Institute for AI. It's a platform that provides a live AIS data feed overlaid with a lot of different satellite imagery sources, and is a very useful sort of live operational tool. Again, no cost. There's different ways to access, and there are no sharing restrictions on the analytical outputs. Skylight's joined the JAC, again, as part of this key sort of coordination function, and is providing key operational support for engagement such as patrols. It has a very short turnaround time for things like satellite imagery. It's increasing the number of different satellite imagery and SAR and other sources into the platform, really trying to push the boundaries of that live real-time analysis. So there's a number of things. I'm not going to go through all of them here, but it's another partner with key data sources and a platform that can be made available to countries for free. Key issues and opportunities for the JAC, and I should say this is what we see as key issues and opportunities for JAC and our country partners. So one of the things that we're trying to leverage now is that there has been a huge advance in state and non-state actor collaboration and public-private cooperation in the last few years. Ironically, as we discussed yesterday, this has been led by the developing world. As an organization, we have always been able to much more easily and constructively work with developing states than we have with many of developed states. And that model has been now understood more and more better, and all of a sudden there is engagement by the big actors in the world, distant water fishing nations, but also countries, for example, like the US and Canada and so on, who have technologies that can be leveraged and assets such as patrol vessels that can be leveraged around this issue. As I mentioned, there was confusion around the multitude of data sources and platforms. There is more and more opportunity and openness for collaboration around data usage and access. There are very clear efficiencies in the delivery assistance, and there's the opportunity for the JAC to serve as a hub for sharing intelligence and making sense of the various technologies and data offerings that are out there. This is covering quite a lot of what I've discussed, but we're trying to integrate the wide arrays of information, make that more readily accessible, have the corresponding capacity building so that those tools are understood and can be integrated into national institutions and processes, and make sure that decisions are better data driven and there's more transparency. I mentioned this morning in one of my comments about making technology work for the people using it, not the other way around. Technology is not a solution in itself. So a large part of our focus here is how do we work with partner countries to make sure that the technology that we bring to bear, but also how that complements to what is already there, is best used for their fisheries enforcement and their broader fishery government's needs. This is a really, really crucial aspect to it. There's no other, if we're not doing this, then there is no point. At the core of what we're doing are our country partners. There are the JAC partners, but we also have broader partners, not necessarily members of the JAC, but who we intend to work with and are already working with in many cases. So there are technical partners, there are operational partners, funding partners, of course, and they don't have to be exclusive. We're working more and more with the Canadian Department for Fisheries and Oceans. Some countries are gaining access to now what they call their DVD satellite system, the Dark Vessel Detection System. Canada is working more and more with us. We've got an upcoming patrol, for example, in one region we're working with. Well, they'll make that available. But they're also an operational partner in terms of running particularly air patrols, and also a funding partner in terms of broader operations. And we've got some clear impacts that we seek to deliver. So we want to see demonstrate increase in the number of coastal and port states taking enforcement action to address illegal fishing, uptake and the use and application of technology platforms and data analysis, increase of port inspections, investigative actions, and enforcement responses, increase in data availability and transparency, and increase in the number of policy actions either developed or enhanced based on the evidence that is provided by the JAC. So that is the background of the partners, who we are, why we're doing what we are doing, and so on. At this stage, we're now going to move on to a look at vessel tracking. I'm going to hand over to Charlie to do an initial introduction to vessel tracking, some key components of it, and then we're going to look at some tools that are available for addressing this issue. Over to you.
Thank you. Yeah. So through our work using different sources of tracking information, we've learned a few things about sort of how the system is sort of working at the moment, and some of the observations we've got about how it can sort of best be applied. So I'm just going to run through a little bit of those to give everyone sort of in the room a sort of an understanding of where we're at with the different sources of data, some of the limitations and some of the benefits, and how they can sort of potentially work together a little bit. So I'm going to kick off with sort of like, it might be relatively obvious, but it's sort of good to sort of touch on it. But really is like, why are we tracking vessels? And it is quite critical because it's the rationale behind like vessel monitoring systems has developed through time as technology has developed and capability developed, the opportunities to expand the scope. So the very first VMS systems were really developed for safety. They were developed to know where the fishing boats were, so when they got in trouble, they could get help. That soon developed, because you're tracking them, to the function around compliance. And this is really one of the key functions for VMS now. But even that is developing very much within the scope of how it can support driving forward greater compliance within the fishing sector. And the other area of it is really around science and stock, so sort of ecosystem management. So really thinking about this can be sort of co-management as well. but like thinking about how the data can be used to understand the fisheries more, to lead back into the science and the management decisions and the policy decisions. So that those within each of those areas, there's quite a lot of different aspects where the scope can sort of on each area can be increased. And some of the emerging trends we have at the moment is automation in the VMS system, which is essentially the automated identification of events. So if you have events or operations or activities of fishing boats which are regulated, and you have a VMS system of thousands of vessels, like some countries do, and you have maybe six people on each shift looking at the VMS data, they've got to monitor 6,000 vessels. It's quite challenging. So you really need to build bigger and bigger teams to look at all that data. So the more data you get, the more people you need to look at it. So really the automation in identifying when those, using the data to identify when those regulated events are occurring so they can be checked. And as much automation in that can be brought into it, can help make those efficiencies and make those 6 VMS analysts much more effective across the whole 6,000 vessels or whatever you're working with. So that's definitely a big emerging trend, and that's one of the things we're going to look at today. Multiple data sources and integration, that's bringing other data sources into AIS is another one of those. And also the data sharing and sort of transparency element. And this is really, this is quite critical, because a lot of the sort of MCS sort of policies and mechanisms that exist do rely on some level of data sharing. As we talked today, fisheries are transboundary, so that information needs to be transboundary too. So it needs to be able to get into the hands of the people that can use it to make the monitoring, control, and surveillance decisions they need to make effectively. So that I got a quote there from 2010 in one of the Sophia FAO reports, which is really when it started sort of looking at this sort of transparency issue in fisheries. And since then, it really has developed quite far, but it's still got quite a long way to go of how data like vessel monitoring system data can be shared between governments and other stakeholders. So the existing environment. So the main VMS, which is one that most people will be familiar with, this is the National Vessel Monitoring System. It generally uses providers that from satellite communications, like constellations. So this is direct communication, so message from the vessels up to satellite and then down to the server. But more recently, there's been a development in what's called IVMS or inshore VMS, which is using a few different techniques to send the data back to the server. So it could be using mobile phone networks, could be using other satellites other than direct communication ones. And there's a variety of other antennas and other systems that can send the data back to the server. And finally, there's AIS has also been used more and more in fisheries monitoring, which is slightly different to how it works with the VMS, because it doesn't. The main difference is with AIS is the transponder on the vessel is sending the information out for whoever's listening. So it's not sending it and waiting for a satellite to tell it's been received and then it stops sending it. It just keeps sending information for whoever's listening. So essentially the satellites or the ground stations or other vessels pick it up. And that is initially designed to be a navigation system. So it's, and in the current system, it's also it's not great harmonization across countries about how VMS is implemented, how the data is standardized, and how the sort of the functionality of the system is standardized. There's also quite a large variation how AIS is regulated. Some regions, some countries mandate the use of AIS even on fishing vessels. Some don't mandate it on fishing vessels. And even when it is mandated, it can be mandated in very different ways and by different agencies. And then implementation of those regulations around AIS can be very different in terms of how much they're implemented. But that all goes into how the data's worked. So thinking about the automation, so what we try and do is take the track, wherever it's come from, whether it's come from the vessel monitoring system track or from AIS, but the vessel's positions, and we look at those positions and they get run through a machine learning algorithm, which looks to try and identify which part of those tracks is actively fishing, or it could be another type of event as well. But the main one we do is where it's actively fishing. and it runs differently depending on the sort of type of vessel it is. So it tries to pick those different fishing activities up and understand what the vessel is actually doing in terms of what type of fishing. And so the fishing effort is the main algorithm we have. That was the original one, but we also try and bring as much identity information into that as well. So vessel database like RFMO lists, national list for authorizations and licenses, and things like that. Ports and voyages. So we try to identify when the vessels go in and out of port, so you can start tracking them port to port, so you can see what everything they're doing, all the events that occur between the ports, and we'll touch on that in a bit more detail. Transshipment, so we can't tell if a vessel's meeting at sea to do with transshipment of fish, but what we can see are the vessels meeting at sea. So we call it an encounter. If two vessels meet at sea, other organizations call it slightly differently, like rendezvous and things like that. So all we can see is the vessels meet. We don't know that anything was transshipped, but it's an indicator that transshipment may have happened. And you can also look at behavior of vessels and see when they slow down on the water as well, which might indicate that they may have done a transshipment. And we also look for, it says here dark targets, but it's essentially, when we talk about that, we really mean vessels which are not being publicly tracked. When we talk about dark targets, if you're a government agency and you have access to your VMS data, dark targets might mean something slightly different. It might mean vessels which aren't on your VMS and not publicly tracked. So it's really boats that for the user, you can't see them because they're not tracked in a system you have access to. So thinking about how those different data sources vary, this is just a quick demonstration. So these are all the points from a fishing vessel in a given amount of time from the VMS system, which is this one's running at 1 hourly. So you get a position every hour, and this is what the data looks like. And for the same boat, if you add in all the positions from the AIS, the boat vessel is also transmitting on, you can see you have a lot more resolution, and you can see a lot more detail of what the vessel was doing. And then if you also have access to the AIS of all the other vessels in the area, which not necessarily you flag, VMS systems are mostly pointed at the flag state, have access to the data. But with AIS, it can be more broad access. If you look at that data, you can then see other vessels which you may not be under your flag or under your management, but you can see their potential interactions. And in this case, the fishing vessel met with a bunker vessel. So this is just demonstrating what by layering that data and bringing it together, what you can the different understanding you can build from doing that. But it's not all AIS in particular is not an ideal data source for monitoring fishing vessels. The reception is based on, as I said, the satellites or the ground stations or other vessels harvesting that data. So like listening and harvesting it. So it does depend on the reception of those receivers. This map over here, you've got, there's two main classes of AIS, Class A and Class B. A being more powerful. This is SOLAS. Under SOLAS, this is what big vessels over 300 gross tons doing international voyages have to have. And Class B is sort of for vessels that don't have to meet SOLAS requirements, but do want to use AIS. They more typically use this Class B. So a lot of fishing boats use Class B that are under 300 gross tons. And what you can see here, where it's very light pink, is very good reception essentially, and where it's dark purple, it means the reception is not very good. Which basically the way AIS works means it's very high density of vessels in one location, and the receivers can't manage having that many vessels in their footprint to pick all the data up. So essentially, in high density areas of vessels, you basically lose reception and you don't pick up so many positions from the boat. So you can see here really where you'd kind of expect, particularly sort of around sort of Asia through the Mediterranean to North Europe and a bit around the US. There's very high densities of vessels, and you get this not particularly good reception. So it really does get this bias towards areas. So if you look on the map here, all the fishing activity, you can see that doesn't look like there's really any fishing activity in this area of Asia, but we all know there is, but you just can't see it on the AIS. So you have to keep this in mind. There are biases in the data, but based on the reception and based on whether or not boats are using it. So if vessels don't typically use AIS for that reason, they're not going to show up, even if there's good reception. So that's the two main sources of biases, not the only ones, but that's two main ones you have to keep in your mind. And if you're trying to use this data on the sort of high seas in the southern Indian Ocean, where there's very good reception, it'll be different to trying to use it in very high density areas in Asia. You'll be able to see a lot more. And yeah, in terms of that sort of usage, you see a lot of different usage. So as I said earlier, it's regulated to use AIS on fishing boats in some regions. The European Union's one of those, US, Canada, Bahrain. There's a load of, technically the FFA in the Pacific as well, good standing. They should have AIS. So there are a number of different either regions or countries or fisheries where it's regulated. The vessel does use it, but not always. So this is detecting vessels from actually where they're emitting light at nighttime. So for this case, vessels typically that are fishing for squid. And you can see here in blue, these are detections where the vessel has been transmitting on AIS at the same time it was detected. And the ones in orange are where it wasn't transmitting on AIS where it's detected. So you can see there's a lot of activity here on the high seas on this squid fishery where there was no AIS from the vessel. So you can see, and you could, there are some calculations you can do to try and work out what the ratio is of vessels on AIS if you're interested. And you can tell that actually inside the Omani EZ here, you have a lot of activity on orange, so not being detected in AIS. So yeah, so that kind of gives you an idea of what the sort of transparency element is for. Because if you had a full coverage of tracking for that, you'd better see that activity a lot clearer in the Omani EZ. So just finally, just sort of summarize those between the two, VMS and AIS, and thinking about why, if AIS isn't great in a few ways, why are governments using it to monitor vessels? And we put it on our public map. It's really, so in VMS, instead, it's very dedicated, secure and reliable tracking system. But it typically does have very low transmission times, like every 1 hour, or sometimes every 2 hours, or even 4 hours. So you don't get a lot of resolution of the vessel's movements, which makes it harder to do the automation on it. And also the systems are by design restricted access generally. So they're coming, even if the government wants to share the data with a partner, it can be quite challenging technically. So it's not always set up for easy sharing. And where AIS is different, it's not secure, it can be turned off. So there's lots of issues with it, the reception issue, everything I've gone through, but it is pretty cost effective. It can be easily shared between agencies and managers. And you can also see beyond your fleet. Your VMS access is limited to the vessels you're allowed to see, or you have management of, in whatever agreements you're a part of. But with AIS, you can actually see what maybe some of the foreign vessels which might be operating with AIS, but they can turn it off. So it's really these areas and this high transmission rate which allows for automation. It's these things which means that people are using AIS for monitoring fisheries, but it's not necessarily ideal. So what kind of the data sources together work actually very well because you have the secure element and the resolution. So there probably is a solution which in the future that build some of these new ideas that have learned from AIS into some of the VMS elements. But yes, okay, yeah. So I mean that's kind of going through it. I mean I don't know if it's worth stopping for questions there, because we've both just gone through quite a lot, and I think if we have a breather before we get into the tools, it might be useful to have some questions.
Tafsir, please.
Thank you. I forgot to introduce myself in the last question I posed. I'm an assistant professor here at the World Maritime University. My question is very simple, and what really caught my attention was that slide where you mentioned poor harmonization So for regulatory standards, which organization do you currently turn to look at draft standards? Because I'm also dealing with robotics and autonomous systems, but not necessarily from IUU fishing point of view or fisheries point of view, but these have expanded usages. So if harmonization is a problem, then you need techno-regulatory standards to govern regulations that govern the technology itself. So how do you bring out like solutions to that? Do you have a blueprint in the works? Because that is very important before mass deployment of these technologies, before you transfer the problems to developing states. So sorry if that's out of the scope of the discussion. So
no, it's a very good question, and it's something we're looking at. It doesn't exist. I mean, there are guidelines. FAA produces guidelines on VMS and sort of standards on that. With AIS, there is a UN body, ITU, the International Telecommunications Union. That's where AIS sort of like comes under, and that is standardized. But I guess the AIS in some ways is more standardized in terms of the data, the actual data and the fields in the data, but it's less standardized maybe than VMS in terms of how it's regulated, and particularly on fishing vessels. So yeah, the harmonization. So there is, I mean, there's two. It's quite different, like even regulatory systems for both types of data. VMS is usually sat with the fishing department or the Navy or the Coast Guard, where the AIS is particularly with the communications agency of the country or the Coast Guard or similar. So there definitely is a need for that. I don't think it's really been done.
And just to add to that, I mean, the regulatory frameworks that do exist around AIS are probably the least enforced of any on the oceans right now. I mean, to give an example, one of the challenges that we're facing with vessel tracking data from AIS right now is that there is an increasingly cluttered picture at sea from AIS being used on fishing gear markers. Now, under the framework, they're not supposed to be using the channels that are dedicated for AIS. In reality, it's a cheap and easy way for them to have some tracking transponders on gear. But as I say, it's really muddling the picture of what's happening at sea. On the other hand, it's an interesting information source because very often you can't see the boat, but you might see their gear. So there's an indication of fishing activity where vessels were dark otherwise.
You need to go on the microphone. Otherwise, nobody can hear you.
Oh, okay. So there are standards, and correct me if I'm wrong, if like I say that it's a fragmented landscape. And states are doing like DIY, right? But nothing is harmonized at the international level.
There's a framework for it. For example, every country has a sequence, what's called the MMSI number, which is what's broadcast over AIS. That's the unique signature of that broadcast. And each country has a sequence of numbers that are assigned to it. But you can also just put in the number 0000000 in there and you will broadcast. And we see that frequently, again, which causes a challenge because you've got 10 vessels broadcasting over 00000. You get, of course, a very muddled tracking picture. So yeah, there's a lot of work to be done in terms of not just the regulation of that space, but the implementation of that.
Yeah, and where nationally, where it comes down to enforcing, particularly on regulation and AIS. So if a vessel comes in as being inspected for a fisheries department, is that fisheries department going to check that the AIS is broadcasting, on a registered on a registered sort of MMSI number with the relevant agency in the country it's from? And that doesn't really typically happen. That's more generally sits with the sort of the Coast Guard or whichever sort of maritime authority the country has. So it depends on each country. So that ad hoc is a little bit like that. And some countries do a much better job at regulating the use of radio equipment like AIS than others. But it's not generally in the fisheries mindset to check things like that, but it easily can be. So yeah, and some countries are now regulating the use of it for fishing vessels or fishing vessels coming into the port. And the way EU does it is fishing vessels using the EU ports regulated to have it on. So yeah, that changes it a little bit, and that gives it a broader kind of viewpoint from the different authorities to regulate it.
Hello, I'm Kwejo Forson from Ghana. My question has to do with, is there any link between a cyber attack in relation to increase in this IUU fishing? Because I realize looking at the tracking systems that you have, is there any way we could link these two?
A what attack? Sorry, a
cyber attack.
A cyber attack.
Considering the tracking systems that are being used on board.
So, I mean, the data that comes from any of those systems ends up in a server somewhere, and they will be any server, whether it's set in a government or a provider, a company that provides a service to the country, is susceptible to cyber attacks. So a vessel monitoring system could be shut down by that reason by someone who's willing to do that. I never heard of it happening, but it could do. AIS is definitely the actual transmission end of it. Can be, there are a lot of issues. The unit itself can transmit the position in the wrong place. So it looks like the boat's in the Antarctic, but really it's fishing just off the coast in Mozambique or Madagascar. That's a very common one. And it's either a faulty equipment or it's a deliberate. It's hard to tell. Sometimes it seems it's one or the other. And the other one is that all of these systems relies on GPS, and GPS can be tampered with externally. So a device can be used to mess with that GPS receiver and make it think it's doing something it's not. And we've seen that in a number of cases, sort of all over the world. It's definitely growing, but it generally needs a physical thing that's going to in the vicinity of the GPS receiver that gives it the sort of mixed up signals.
Thank you very much. I asked that because I worked on maritime cybersecurity for my dissertation, and as part of the data gathering, I inquired from the personnel who worked on at the Maritime Operations Center, and they did indicate that they've had a bit of evidence where on their screens it indicated like some fishing vessels are fishing at a particular position just for them to signal the naval vessels to get there, and there was nothing, but they could still see that they've given them false positions. So I asked just to find out if there are some other data.
Yeah, so it can be tampered with. Even vessel monitoring systems, the VMS, which is a lot secure than AIS, can be tampered with. Yeah, nothing's perfectly secure.
Sure. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Well, one thing I would add is that sometimes tampering with the systems is actually an indicator for activities that need investigation. So sometimes it can even highlight where to investigate further. So it doesn't always help the vessel to get away with things. It can actually indicate an investigation is needed. So,
hi, good afternoon, everybody. So my name is Tessie, and I would love to ask this question from like a legalistic point of view. So in regards to all like the regulations that are governing this particular technology, how do you encourage enforcement mechanisms for like developing states or other member states? I mean, I know that implementation or enforcement mechanisms is at the discretion of each member state, or so how do you encourage that? I just wanted to get like a rounded appreciation of this.
Can I start on this?
Yeah.
Maybe I'll take a first stab at sort of the bigger picture on this, and then I'll hand over to Charlie in terms of the specifics. So no doubt whatsoever within the use of technology, one of the biggest challenges is legal frameworks keeping up with the pace of technology. And probably many of you have experienced the slow rate that a legal change or a legal update can take, depending at what level too, if you're at the Fisheries Act or the regulatory level and so on. Within the countries we work with, we've got countries who are working with laws that are 1 or 2 years old and very up to date and can really utilize and integrate technology into their planning, investigative, prosecutional processes. Where there's another country we're working with, they're still working on a 1954 law. So that's thankfully being updated now, but that is sort of the range. And so, of course, their ability to deal with how technology comes into play and is very different. One of the things that we encourage is to have regulatory frameworks that allow for there to be management decisions that allow for the integration of new technology. So, for example, while, for example, mandating VMS might not be captured in a regulation, if there is the ability to make it a management decision that a vessel must have VMS as part of its licensing condition, then it's a much easier way to integrate that technology into the fisheries management regimes and thereby also how that's enforced.
I mean, the only thing I really add to that is just about the harmonization piece and just how, particularly regionally, with as fisheries are quite transboundary, that having a harmonization of how you're regulated for some of these things, and particularly in licensing conditions, so having harmonized licensing conditions, so vessels within a region all have the same requirements in terms of being tracked, and then having cooperations where you can share that information as you need to in those regions, or whatever mechanism you want to do to share that information is really important. So yeah, so that's all I'd add, I think.
Yeah, I mean, understanding the legal frameworks around this is very important for us in terms of the technical assistance we provide, but also for practitioners, you yourselves, in terms of how this can be applied as well. I mean, using AIS as an example, we are very prescriptive in our description of AIS as we see it as an intelligence source. It's not evidence of any activity. Using AIS, you can see an indicator of an activity, but we always strive to and encourage our partner countries to develop evidence based on that initial intelligence indicator. So whether that's using other intelligence sources, maybe there's an indicator a vessel on AIS is loitering at sea. Maybe you then use another information source like satellite aperture radar or optical satellite imagery to confirm that maybe it's alongside another vessel at sea. Then when that vessel comes into port, conducting an inspection. So you build the evidence based on what that initial AIS intelligence indicator provided to you. But that first indicator is not evidence in itself. So this is a really important description, delineation between what is intelligence and what is evidence. And that is a whole lecture in itself.
Yeah, there's only a very small handful of cases where they've been built solely on this kind of data. And there generally needs to be more physical evidence to go with it.
How are we doing for time?
So we've got half an hour till break.
Okay, should we go into?
Yeah. It's another questions on that before we go into.
Oh, lots.
Sorry.
Good afternoon. I'm Nishant from Sri Lankan Coast Guard.
Hi.
So I would like to know, you mentioned in TMT tracking, and you are gathering intelligence and also the sharing them into the bilateral and the regional countries. So can you please elaborate, so which kind of the intelligence and information you are gathering? And also I would like to know, so do you have any database in terms of the vessels which illegal activities committed by the vessels, and if it is there, it's open for the publics? I would like to know. Thank you.
So hold that thought, because we're going to be getting on to some TMT tools a little bit later, including our database, and I'll answer some of those questions then. And that will include also sort of the intelligence that we're gathering in and how we utilize it.
Just one comment from Medina.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for this first part of the presentation. I would like to know, you have this possibility to detect the use of IS in different places in the world. So can you know, or do you have the possibility also to know why some vessels are not using it? If, for example, they shut down intentionally the IS, or if it is broken or not functioning. Thank you.
Yeah, so this is something we've looked at quite a lot, and we will have a kind of a product on our map being released. There's a paper on it being released very soon, in a couple of weeks. We'll have there's a paper on that exact question. I can't remember which journal it's in. Maybe Science Advances, but we'll release the sort of the product of that on our map about where the AIS is switched off, and what we can try and tell is whether or not the gap in the data is from a problem with the reception for that vessel. So the vessel was likely still transmitting, but there was no one there to pick it up. There was no receiver to pick it up, or whether it was deliberate. So whether other boats around it are still having their data collected, but that one isn't. So we can try and identify when these gap events are deliberate versus a reception problem. But to actually understand why they turned it off from the data, we don't really know that. That's hard to do. But what we can, as Duncan was saying, you can just use that as an indicator to initiate further investigation, likely when it comes to port. So that it can be that sort of indicator that increases that vessel up the sort of priority list for being inspected when it arrives in port. So that's kind of, and that can be based on your capacity and how many boats are coming in have this kind of gap in data. So yeah, we try and communicate that information through our products so that indicator can be used where it's appropriate as that reason for carrying out inspections. And then you can check in the logbook, you can check in the sort of engineering logbook on sort of hold temperatures and things like that. You can do a full sort of investigation of the vessel and try to determine what it did at that time. But then you've also got one specific day or group of days to focus on an investigation on as well when you didn't have the tracking information. So it gives you that really targeted approach.
And for the reasons vessels might not be broadcasting at all, I mean, there are a very broad number of reasons. Some vessels might not have it at all. It's never been a requirement. Some vessels, it's not enforced, so they don't use it. There are some extreme cases. So for example, Iran bans the use of AIS on vessels. What's very interesting with that is we see the vessels that are fishing on the high seas go from there into Pakistan. They all pick up these units that they then use on their gear. They all originate in one warehouse. We can track all these trackers to a single location that then go all the way out to sea. And we know that they're Iranian vessels because they're not allowed to have those units, and they drop them off in Pakistan before they then go back to port. So there's a number of different reasons why vessels might not be on AIS at all. And you could do a back of an envelope calculation about how many of the industrial fleet around the world, particularly the distant water fleet, are or not on AIS. But it's very hard to have very firm numbers on it.
It's probably about 60% on the high seas.
Yeah,
something like that.
On the high seas, yeah.
On the high seas, not in coastal states. It's much lower.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we'll continue on.
Yeah, so we can thinking about the sort of tools we have. Is a very quick overview to it. I sort of showed you a picture earlier, and we'll look into this a bit more now. We have the public map, which shows you very area-based focus on the data. And that's in each of these sort of tools we have on the website, essentially different ways of viewing that data. So we have the area-based one, which is our map. Very much linked to that is a Marine Manager portal, but this allows a bit more flexibility at bringing other data sources in. This is thinking about sort of like use, like human use and oceanography, or you could look at where sharks are being tracked. It says a whole lots of things you could put into this tool to understand what's happening on the water to help with essentially mostly spatial management. So where you might introduce an MPA that protects, some certain species you're looking to protect, but you also know that it's not going to impact, say, the fishing industry too much. So you can use it to sort of select the most appropriate places to put things like MPAs. So that's the goal for that tool. We're going to go through a little bit later for the carrier vessel portal, which is a real focus on transshipment. We have the vessel viewer, which is not on the public map yet because it's still being a pilot, being developed with TMT as a sort of a JAC tool. And this is very much at the vessel level, so looking at all the events and history and the identity of a vessel by vessel. And then we also do an API portal, which is new. And this is so you could bring any of the data we have in the systems into your own system if you want to. That's new and sort of in development. So that means you don't have to rely on our website to get the data. You could bring it into your own. Yeah. So I'll do a quick until I'll just keep going until it's time for break. So just let me know when to stop. But so this is the public map. You initially kind of come in and log in. So you don't have to log in to get access, but you get more features in it with having an account. The account is completely free. There's no cost to having an account. You just need a email address to set the account up on, and then you can get slightly better access. You get with our licensing agreement. This helps to get all the identity of the vessels that you can see in the map. It has some like question marks around the place, so you can get a little bit more information when you first look at it. So if you haven't seen it before, I'll just turn those sort of off for now. I'm going to turn those off. And hang on, I had to move this bar. So I can dismiss that. So in terms of the public map, what you're seeing here is essentially this heat map. So all these squares are where we see have seen fishing. What we have estimated to be fishing activity from the vessels. So we've looked at the track, it's run through the algorithms, and it's picked up the bits of the vessel's track that we think are fishing activity. It's not perfect, but it's sort of an estimate of that. And then we grid that on the world. So what I'll do, I'll look at the Eastern Pacific, I think, just for this demonstration. I can turn on here lots of layers down in the reference layers. So this is all the exclusive economic zones. So I'll look at the Eastern Pacific because this is quite interesting to look at squid. And this is also a region where we have the most partnerships with countries around transparency of fishing data. A number of, I think, people here actually are from some of the countries. So Chile, Peru, Ecuador, Costa Rica, Panama, Belize, and Brazil. Yeah, that's right. Maybe I missed one. Are all currently partnered with us sharing data. So the layer with the orange layer you see here is actually those countries' vessel monitoring system data, and the kind of turquoisey green color is from the AIS. So just gives you that sort of representation of the region. And quite a lot of activity actually is not on AIS, but is on the VMS in this region in particular. But I think I'm going to focus mostly for this demonstration at the AIS because that's universal for everywhere, all regions. So what is different about this public map and most of the other systems you might be used to is the way it looks at the data. Most systems you're probably used to want to know what's happening right now. So the most recent data and gives you that picture of where all the activity is right now. And that's very helpful for when you're monitoring vessels in real time, doing operations and things like that. It's a very important system to have. We've deliberately not tried to make a system that overlaps too much with that. We tried to have a slightly different approach to how to look at the data. So all our data is delayed by 3 days. So whether it's from a country sharing their vessel monitoring system data, that's got a 72-hour delay. And also the AIS data, we do have a 72-hour delay on that. So it doesn't show the last 3 days, and that sort of just rolls through. And that's also deliberate to not get confused with this operational systems that exist that people use. And what's kind of unique is this, what we call the time bar at the bottom, which gives you ability to set the period of time you're interested in, and allows really to sort of look at trends and patterns. So if I just go to the years, so if I look in this region, you can see activity there. This is just in this so far this year in 2022. So you can look at all that activity over a period of time. And the reason sort of looking at this region is because it's quite interesting to sort of see how some of the behavior we can see on here, and we can filter. So if I filter the data with a gear type, the gear types aren't perfect, but some of them work quite well. So I take squid jiggers, so vessels generally targeting squid. You can see their activity in 2020. If I change this and just show in 2022, and if I go back, actually show you, in 2020 was an interesting year for the squid fishery in that region. There was a lot of activity that was very close to the different countries. So the Galapagos area for Ecuador, and also Peru. You can see that a lot of activity on the high seas. So these vessels are operating under SPERFMO, are really tight up against the boundaries. And there was a huge amount of media interest, NGO interest, and government interest at this time for the scale of these fleets. And this kind of gives you, and this type of system allows you to get the sort of an understanding of the number of vessels you can do. You can download like all the vessels that are active inside a particular area. You can draw your own area or pick an EZ or something. But you can see that in that year, there was a lot of activity. And the one thing we've seen change since then is, if I zoom out, that's the whole period ever. And I look at just 2021 season, particularly if I focus in at the end of that actual season, coming into the late summer where it really starts. You can see there's actually been a lot of activity, more on the high seas, with the vessels generally keeping a distance from the EZs. And we're not sure why this is. This could be to do with the biology of the squid at the time, and the same has been happening this year. Or it could be that the vessels are deliberately keeping away because of the issues that we created in 2020. So we don't really know that, but it's an interesting, this gives you a demonstration of how the tool can show you these trends and patterns that over periods of time. And this is what a system that shows you the here, right, and now doesn't really do. So this tries to build a system that gives you that really kind of like long-term approach. The data goes back to 2012, but there wasn't a lot of satellites, a lot of boats using AIS at that time, fishing boats in particular using AIS in that time. So there's not a lot of data back then, but you just through time, the amount of data you can see is almost increased. That's both through more satellites in the sky picking up the data and more boats adopting it as a system on board their vessels. And in this region, we can also look at, this is light detection data. As it loads, so it's again gridded, and this we matched to AIS as well. So in this period, we got that data from 2017. So if I just look at last year, you can see that they're very much similar to the AIS. You see a lot of vessels emitting light at nighttime being detected by these satellites in the same areas that match very closely to where we're seeing the squid vessels. So you can switch on, you can filter and filter between whether or not it was matched to AIS or not. So true is the vessel, that detection was matched to AIS, and if you just pick the ones which weren't matched to AIS, then you still get the same picture of where the vessels are, but it gives you that sort of focus on if you are interested in vessels that you can't see in other tracking systems. And it has a similar layer for radar SAR data, which is only coastal though, so it doesn't do the high seas. But that is the whole world. It's from the European Space Agency Sentinel-1 system, and which images the whole world. Most of the world it does every sort of, I think it's 8 to 12 days. It does the whole world, I think, and then it does more sort of Europe focused every 6 days, I think. Actually, yeah, and that's starting that we started that project this year. We're actually loading more historic data into the system, but at the moment we've just loaded into this just so far this year, and that updates again regularly at the 3-day delay. So this again, this is from the detections that you can see from that radar, so SAR, so synthetic aperture radar, where it's detecting vessels on the water. Generally large metal objects, normally over kind of 18 to 20 meters. But sometimes it detects vessels smaller, but not as regularly. And that's not impacted by cloud cover. It works through cloud cover, which makes it a very reliable data source. But the footprint of it is only very sort of, it's overlap with where it's imaging the Earth. So it's very much in the coastal region. So just in general with the tool, you can save workspaces, and this little triangle up here means you can share the link, and then you can copy that link and share that with someone else. They can open it and look at it as well. So the tool is really designed around sharing information. So you can upload your own shape files or your own tracking data. You can upload your own points and polygons as well. So you can upload a lot of different types of data into it that you can then see through time. It works with time as well, if there's a column for time. And then you can sort of build your own sort of workspace with your protected areas and things like that in it, and you can share that with colleagues through the link. So the tool is very much about collaboration. Yeah.
So with the radar data there, what does that actually represent in terms of time? And
yeah,
is that a 1 day a vessel was in that square, or what's the time resolution? And so presumably you can't see actual vessel tracks in that. You just,
yeah, exactly. Good questions. So yeah, so I've just zoomed into 1 month on the time bar. So what you see in terms of the gridded data is whatever the time bar you've got set here. Whatever period that is going to show the detections in that time. Now it's not loading. It will load at some point at the footprint of the images. So you get a spiky line coming along the coast, which will show you where the images were taken, and that will gives you a reference point of where the images were and aren't and are. So you don't think there was no detections where there might have been, but it wasn't imaged. So when that loads, you'll get the spiky line. So in each one of these grids, I can click on, which will load a box and tell me sort of how many detections in this time period were in that grid. And the grids get smaller when you zoom in more. So you can get quite fine resolution if you zoom right in. But you've sort of got 8 detections in that grid in that month. 6 were unmatched to AIS, and 2 were matched to AIS, which was those 2 vessels. So you essentially, the detection itself, we don't really have the images in it because doing the whole world like this is quite a lot of data to get through. So we haven't got the image chips of what the detections look like, but they typically look like a kind of like a white on sort of like a black background of the sea. The way they color the images, the high resolution that stands out. So the brighter the color, the kind of the bigger the sort of the reflection of the radar image, so the more dense the object. So a big metal ship really stands out against the ocean background. And yeah, so that and that you don't know the identity of the vessel unless we matched it to AIS. You don't know the identity. You just know there's a boat there at that time. That's the information it gives you. So again, not something you can prosecute on, but something that gives you that. Either the way our system is focused, it gives you that. You can look over the last year or 2 years or 3 years, whatever you're interested in, and see the patterns hotspots in terms of which seasons and which areas may be getting detections of vessels where they maybe we weren't expecting it, or they don't match up with your other data. And then you could plan a response for that. So you could then plan to have a patrol boat in that area in those months in the future. So it gives you that planning tool for that sort of high level. That's very much where our tool's focused. Or you can use this data through our partner Skylight system during operations to get you onto specific detections during an operation, which is much more sort of like that pointy end focused. You got anything to add to that? No.
No.
So I can keep going through some of the functions, but I don't want to like drown people. So we could take questions on the tool. Yeah.
At the back.
Who is? Yeah.
Thank you so much for the presentation so far. I'd like you to clarify something if it's possible that I misheard, but you were talking about transmission, delayed transmission of AIS, I think. And this also happens to be an issue in terms of the conversations I've been having with some law enforcement agencies or agents in terms of they're talking about some of the positives and limitations of technology. So the fact that if the AIS and the information you're sending is delayed, even when they have the capacity to actually go and verify, by the time they get there, when they get your information and they can interpret this, the vessel is no longer there. So what can they do with your information, especially in situation when the legal, their law is up to date? Can they actually then use your information, despite the fact that they couldn't verify at the time? Can they use it to prosecute the vessels that you have identified, even though by the time the information got there, there was no vessel, if that makes sense?
Yeah.
Thank you.
That makes total sense. So our system doesn't show you where the boat is right now. So with a 3-day delay, the boat's likely not where you can then see it on the map. Now that does mean that you could potentially still have an investigation on that vessel when it comes to port. Still doesn't mean you can easily find out what the vessel was doing in that moment you're interested in. But during that inspection, you may be able to pinpoint its activities at that time through the other information on the vessel. If you do a deep enough inspection, it's usually possible. But if you're unable to have the inspection in port and the vessel's not there, once you see the activity of it, that information, there are cases where it has been used. But they're very rare, and it is very difficult for most countries' legal processes to use that data to have a prosecution or a sanction of some sort, because it's very hard to say exactly what that boat was doing. There's lots of other reasons why the boat may have had a slow movement within the waters of your country. It might have had a mechanical failure or something. So it's very difficult at that point without some other evidence to actually get any prosecution. But if you're focusing on that kind of operational data, you wouldn't necessarily use our system for that. You'd use that on the build up to the operation to understand what's happening in the region, but you wouldn't necessarily use it during the operation. And if you had other systems like Skylight or Sea Vision access to, or your own national system with AIS access, you would have the AIS in much more real time. And that would then potentially be able to get you onto the target you're looking for. But so I don't know if that really answers the question. I think, Duncan, you might have something on it.
No, just to build on that last point. I mean, part of what we're trying to do with the Jack is to understand better the utilization of tools in different scenarios. So as Charlie says, the way that Global Fishing Watch developed their platform in terms of aggregates data over time. If you are, for example, planning a patrol, you can look for the last 5 years in the period of time that you want to plan your patrol. Say it's next month. Where have been the aggregations of fishing activity over the last 5 years? Where do I want to target the vessel, because you want those patrols to be as efficient as possible in terms of time and fuel usage and so on. But then there are other tools in terms of the live data feed of AIS and other information sources, and we'll talk about them this afternoon, in terms of that are much more relevant for that actual live operational aspect. There is not one all accompanying solution right now, and this is part of what we're trying to work towards in this partnership is to move towards better integration of those different tools and their values.
Okay. Thank you so much for the response. I am from your response, of course. I just wanted to add that this sort of limitation is also a problem with sea vision that you talked about and skylight, especially the satellite positioning. And of course, there's been recommendation on how this can be countered in terms of providing live information, for example. And then this leads me to my next question. Why the 3 days delay? Why are you not, I mean, almost as prompt in passing the information? Is there a particular reason behind the delay in passing on the information? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, typically data that's live and real time costs money, and our licensing now it would actually allow us to show it more real time, the data, but there's lots of organizations that provide that and do that. Some of them governments have to pay for that access, or they partner with other agencies like Sea Vision in the US to have access to that kind of data live. And we're deliberately not trying to be in that space, because if you do that, your system has got to be like 24-hour, like on staff on 24 hours to fix it, because people are relying on it for their operations and things like that. So we're not that, because it's free, we're not that kind of organization. So we have this delay to keep us very much focused on that, providing better understanding of what's happening on the water, rather than providing that direct operational support. That's not to say that some of our partners in the JAC do that and can provide some of that information, but we deliberately do delay the AIS for that purpose. And the VMS is similar, but slightly different. Is with the VMS, we have a 3-day delay on that as well. There's a number of reasons for that, which one of them being with AIS, one of the things in the IMO and SOLAS regulates with it is that captain can switch it off if they feel threatened, so a piracy issue or something. The whole way VMS is set up is you can't do that. So if the government is sharing that information publicly, it's generally accepted that it's sensible to have a delay on it. So vessels' immediate position it can't be found out at all times, because there's no ability to switch it off if a vessel felt threatened. So that's one of the reasons why we have a delay on the VMS. The other one is just generally, it's not the way we're sharing it for the type of transparency. It's designed for the countries that, they're opting to share this information, and it's either shared through their website and we put it onto the map through an agreement with them, they're sharing it anyway, or they just use our platform as the sort of the catalyst to share it. But that generally in the agreements we go for the 3 days, even sometimes 5 days if there's a real piracy risk. We're talking with Gabon, and at the moment they are worried about the piracy risk in that region, so they're opting for 5 days for a delay on the VMS. So it's really about the country's intent.
One other quick thing to add to that: in the private sector, there are only really 2 private sector providers of AIS. There were 3, and it still looks like there are 3, but one's bought out the other. And most systems, including ours, but also Sea Vision and others, are using those private providers. Some governments also have their own satellites receiving AIS and so on, but generally those are used at the national level. So those private companies obviously have a commercial model, and it's either a pay for access or, as Global Fishing Watch has negotiated, a delay for the sort of more public open use. So it is about also the realities of the ecosystem of the data sources. Any other questions? Yes.
Thank you very much. Just want to know if public can have access to Global Fishing Watch, or associations, or some individuals?
Absolutely anybody. It's just all you need to do is just sign up to it with your email address, which gives you an account for the website, and then you can. Yeah, when you can get into the system just by going to our Global Fishing Watch website and going to the map. I'm going to show that. That's there. So this is the website under map and data. So you can just go to our map there, and then go to the map, and that takes you straight to it. And down here, there'll just be a little icon of a person, and you can click on there and sign up to the website, and then anyone can have access. It's open source.
Okay, thank you very much.